When Prince Eugene of Savoy died in his sleep on the 21st of April, 1736, he was the wealthiest and most celebrated man in Europe. His string of magnificent palaces, like the breathtaking Belvedere in Vienna, were overflowing with the continent's finest art and priceless manuscripts. He was hailed as the spirit of Christianity, the scourge of the Turks, and the greatest general of his age. His funeral was a spectacle of imperial grandeur, a continent's farewell to the man who had, on at least 3 separate occasions, saved the Habsburg Empire from annihilation. But this man, who died as the ultimate symbol of Austrian power, was not Austrian. He was born enemy territory, Paris. Eugene was born in Paris in 1663, an Italian prince of the House of Savoy. His fate, however, was sealed not by his noble lineage, but by his mother, Olympe Mancini. Olympe was one of the infamous Mazarinettes, the ambitious, alluring nieces of the powerful Cardinal Mazarin. She was brilliant, captivating, and famously the first great love of the young King Louis XIV. For a time, many at court believed she would be queen, but the state demanded a political marriage. Louis was forced to marry the Spanish Infanta. Olympe, furious at her lost destiny, was married off to Eugene's father. Eugene was the 5th child, and a disappointment. He was small, frail, and sickly. While his brothers were destined for the army, he was bookish and quiet. He was deemed effeminate. The decision was made for him. He would go into the church. He was given the mocking nickname Le Petit Abbé, the little abbot. He despised it. He showed no interest in theology, but secretly devoured books on military history, dreaming of a life of action. Then when Eugene was 16, his mother was implicated in the affair of the poisons. This was a terrifying scandal of witchcraft, black masses, and murder that tore the French court apart. Olympe, a client of the chief poisoner, was accused of killing her own husband and plotting to poison the king's mistress. In 1680, Louis XIV banished her. She fled France, a pariah. For young Eugene, this was a catastrophe. He was no longer just the sickly son. He was the son of a witch. The doors of opportunity in France were bolted shut, but his resolve only hardened. In 1683, at age 19, he swallowed his pride and sought an audience with Louis XIV, requesting command of a regiment. The scene was a humiliation. The king looked at the small, dark-clothed boy and reportedly laughed. He dismissed him as too slight for a soldier and better suited to prayer. This wasn't just about his height. It was about his mother's scandal and the rumors of his unmanly nature. This was the moment the little abbot died. Eugene, in a cold rage, renounced his clerical titles and swore an oath that he would not set foot in France again, save as an invader. He was fleeing to France's mortal enemy, the Habsburgs of Austria, and he was riding straight into the most terrifying siege in modern history. As Eugene fled Paris, the Ottoman Empire was at the gates of Vienna. The capital of the Habsburgs was on the verge of annihilation. Emperor Leopold I had fled. This was the clash of civilizations, and Eugene, a 19-year-old fugitive, rode right into it. He arrived in the Habsburg refugee camp, a traitor in the eyes of France. He presented himself to Emperor Leopold. The emperor was suspicious. Was this French boy a spy? But he was also desperate. Eugene's cousin, a commander in the army, vouched for him. Leopold consented to let him serve as a simple volunteer. Eugene joined a dragoon regiment. The rough Austrian veterans mocked the Petit Abbé. He responded with silence and professionalism. On September 12, 1683, the Battle of Vienna began. A combined Polish, German, and Austrian army, led by King John III Sobieski, descended from the Kahlenberg Heights. Eugene was in the thick of the fighting, channeling a lifetime of humiliation into pure, focused ferocity. He was wounded but kept fighting. In the afternoon, Sobieski unleashed his winged hussars in one of the largest cavalry charges in history. The Ottoman army shattered and fled. Vienna was saved. In the aftermath, Eugene had proven his worth, but the victory was darkened by tragedy. His older brother, Louis-Jules, who had fled with him, died of dysentery from a wound. At 20, Eugene was utterly alone. His mother was in exile, his king his enemy, his brother dead. The Habsburg army became his only family. Emperor Leopold, hearing of his cold courage, summoned him. He gave Eugene what Louis XIV had denied him. A commission, he was made colonel of a dragoon regiment. The little abbot was gone. Colonel Prince Eugene of Savoy, the warrior, had arrived. The liberation of Vienna was just the beginning. For 16 years, Eugene dedicated himself to the long, brutal war to drive the Ottomans from Europe. He became the army's most devoted professional. Unlike other highborn officers who spent winters at lavish balls in Vienna, Eugene stayed with his men. He slept in their squalid tents, ate their rations, and endured the freezing winters. He fought corrupt suppliers to get them proper boots and gunpowder. His men, who had first mocked the small, quiet Frenchman, began to revere him. He didn't just command their loyalty, he earned it. They would follow him anywhere. The Great Turkish War was his university, his proving ground, and it was a brutal education. This was not the stylized, polite warfare of the West. This was a war of savage skirmishes, desperate sieges, and no quarter given. In 1684, he was part of the first failed attempt to retake Buda, the ancient capital of Hungary, which had been in Ottoman hands for over 140 years. It was a bloody repulse, a lesson in the fanaticism of the Turkish defenders. In 1685, now 22 years old, his cold courage and sharp tactical mind had already been noted. He was promoted to Major General. At the Battle of Esztergom, he was in the thick of the fight when a musket ball struck his hand, a painful, searing wound. It was the first of many. His body was beginning to become a map of his service. Then in 1686, the Holy League returned to Buda. This was not a battle. It was a 3-month siege of unimaginable savagery. The city, defended by the 70-year-old Lion of Buda, Abdurrahman Abdi Pasha, was one of the strongest fortresses in the world. The 70,000 men of the Allied army began a systematic bombardment. The fighting was medieval in its horror. It was a war of mines and countermines, of subterranean explosions, of men fighting hand-to-hand in the dark, collapsing tunnels. It was a war of escalades, of ladders thrown against walls, of men being boiled with hot oil and shattered by grenades. Eugene, as always, was at the front. He wasn't directing from a safe command tent. He was in the trenches, leading his men in the suicidal assaults on the castle walls. On July 13th, during one such desperate charge, a musket ball struck him. It wasn't a graze. It shattered his left knee. It was a devastating, potentially fatal wound. He was carried, bleeding and unconscious, from the battlefield. For weeks he lay in a field hospital, consumed by fever, as surgeons debated amputating the leg. The little abbé was on the verge of death. He recovered. His iron will, and perhaps the sheer luck that seemed to follow him, pulled him through. But he would never be the same. For the rest of his life he would walk with a slight, almost imperceptible limp, a permanent reminder of the price of his ambition. While he was still recuperating, on September 2nd, Buda finally fell. The Allied army, enraged by the 78 days of brutal resistance, went on a rampage. The Lion of Buda was killed, and the city was sacked and burned. Eugene, 23 years old, was now a scarred, limping veteran. The frail boy Louis XIV had mocked was gone forever, replaced by a hardened, proven commander, and he was not done. The next year, 1687, his leg still healing, he was back in the saddle. At the Second Battle of Mohacs, he commanded a cavalry brigade. The battle was a massive symbolic victory, fought on the same field where the Kingdom of Hungary had been destroyed in 1526. Eugene's cavalry, seeing a gap in the Turkish line, executed a perfect flanking charge that shattered the Ottoman left wing and turned the battle into a rout. He wasn't just a brave colonel anymore. He was displaying a keen, intuitive understanding of timing, terrain, and combined arms. He saw weaknesses his senior officers missed. He was no longer just a fighter. He was a commander. Emperor Leopold, seeing this, promoted him again to lieutenant general. In 1688, he was at the siege of Belgrade, the gateway to the Balkans. Once again, he was at the head of the assault, one of the first over the walls, and once again he was struck down. This time, it was a severe saber cut to the head. He was found under a pile of bodies, bleeding profusely from a gash that had split his helmet. This near-death experience, his third in 3 years, only added to his legend. The men, who already loved him, now whispered that he was charmed, that he couldn't be killed. Prince Eugene was touched by fate. By 1689, he was a general of cavalry. He was 26 years old, but just as the Turks were on the verge of total collapse, Eugene's old life came roaring back. In the West, his old nemesis, King Louis XIV, seeing the Habsburgs occupied with the Turks, launched his own opportunistic invasion of the German states. The 9 Years' War had begun. Suddenly, Eugene was pulled from the Turkish front. The emperor needed his best commanders to fight a new enemy, to fight France. This was the moment his oath was made real. In 1690, he was sent to Italy, to his own ancestral lands of Savoy, to command the imperial cavalry. The enemy commander was Nicolas Catinat, one of Louis XIV's finest and most methodical marshals. The French soldiers he now faced were men who could have been his comrades. The generals were men who had dined at his mother's table. It was a war that was deeply, bitterly personal. And to make the situation 1,000 times worse, his commander-in-chief in this new theater was, in a twisted stroke of irony, another cousin, Victor Amadeus II, the Duke of Savoy. This was the man who had also rejected Eugene's request for a commission all those years ago. Now, by a quirk of fate, Eugene was his subordinate. If Eugene was a man of iron loyalty, Victor Amadeus was a man of no loyalty at all. He was known as the Fox of Savoy, a brilliant, cynical politician whose only allegiance was to himself. He was infamous for selling his alliance to the highest bidder, and he had a spectacular talent for switching sides at the most inconvenient moment. Eugene found the Italian theater a frustrating nightmare. At the Battle of Staffarda in 1690, he used his own scouts and correctly identified Catinat's position. He warned his cousin that the army was walking into a trap. Victor Amadeus, arrogant and dismissive of his younger cousin, ignored him. The Allied army marched straight into the trap and was routed. It was Eugene, commanding the rearguard, who salvaged the situation. With his own cavalry, the dragoons who adored him, he executed a series of brilliant, disciplined charges. He held off the victorious French army long enough for the Allied infantry to escape. He saved the army from annihilation, but it was a bitter, infuriating lesson. He had been right, and his commander had been wrong, and thousands of men had died for it. He spent the next several years in a grinding, thankless war in the mountains of Piedmont. He was wounded again, captured and briefly held by the French. He escaped, but the war dragged on. This frustrating pattern of his cousin's incompetence would define the entire campaign. In 1693, at the Battle of Marsaglia, it happened again. Victor Amadeus once more dismissed Eugene's tactical warnings, leading the army into an even greater disaster, and once more it fell to Eugene to manage the chaos. His own horse was shot out from under him as he fought a desperate rearguard action, barely escaping capture while trying to salvage what was left of the routed army. He was learning from these defeats. He was learning how not to command. He saw the arrogance of Victor Amadeus, and he saw the cool, logistical professionalism of his enemy, Catinat. But most of all, he was learning the bitter cynicism of politics. Then in 1696, the Fox of Savoy lived up to his name. Victor Amadeus, seeing the war turning against him, secretly negotiated a separate peace with Louis XIV. He abruptly switched sides, declared a truce, and joined his French enemies. Eugene and the imperial army were betrayed. They were now enemies in their own allies' territory. They were forced to fight their way out of Italy, hounded by their former comrades. This betrayal was the final, brutal lesson. It was not just a political maneuver. It was a betrayal by his own blood in his own homeland. Let us pause and consider his world. His French family had scorned him. His brother was dead. His mother was a wandering disgrace. And now his Italian family, his last connection to his heritage, had betrayed him. He was 33 years old. He had no one. He had nothing except the emperor and the army. His loyalty to the Habsburgs, forged in the fire of Vienna, was now sealed in the ice of this betrayal. He returned to Vienna a changed man. He was no longer just a brilliant general. He was a political force, a man with no other interests, no other family, no other life, save the preservation of the empire that had taken him, and Eugene was forced to learn a new and dirtier kind of warfare. The war of the back room, the whispered insinuation, the political maneuver. He spent his time in Vienna, not at balls or parties, but in his study. He began to build his vast library, reading voraciously. He corresponded with philosophers. He was building his own fortress, one of intellect and self-sufficiency. And most importantly, he began building his own intelligence network. He used his personal funds to create a ring of spies that bypassed the official, sluggish, and he suspected corrupt channels of the state. He would trust no one but himself and the men who bled with him. In 1697, his two worlds, the battlefield and the court, collided in the single most important event of his early life. The war in the West against France was winding down, but the Great Turkish War, which had smoldered for 14 years, still raged. The new Sultan, Mustafa II, was young, ambitious, and wanted to undo all the Habsburg gains. He dreamed of retaking Hungary, of avenging the defeats of the past decade. He had taken personal command of the Ottoman army, and in 1695 and 1696 had won a string of victories against the cautious old guard imperial commanders. The emperor needed a single decisive blow to force the Turks to the negotiating table for good. The old guard had failed. Reluctantly, with no other real choice, Emperor Leopold gave supreme command of the army in Hungary to the 34-year-old field marshal, Prince Eugene. The court was apoplectic. To give the most important army of the empire to this boy, this abrasive foreign adventurer? Starhemberg and the Whitewigs immediately set to work to ensure his failure. As president of the Imperial War Council, Starhemberg deluged Eugene with conflicting, confusing, and most importantly, deliberately restrictive orders. The most important order was this: Eugene was explicitly forbidden from risking the main army in a pitched battle without the direct written approval of the War Council in Vienna. It was a political leash. They had tied his hands. They were terrified he would win, and just as terrified he would lose. They set him up to fail. Eugene arrived at the front in July 1697. He found the army in disarray, its morale shattered by 2 years of defeat. He immediately set to work. He drilled the men, he secured new supplies, and, most importantly, he unleashed his private spy network. For weeks, the two massive armies, Eugene's 50,000 men and the Sultan's 80,000, shadowed each other across the plains of Hungary. The Sultan, just as wary, refused to be drawn into an open battle. Time was running out. Winter was approaching. The court in Vienna was growing impatient, sending Eugene daily dispatches demanding to know why he hadn't won yet, while simultaneously reminding him he was forbidden to fight. Then on September 10th, Eugene's spies brought him the news he had been waiting for. The Sultan had made a fatal mistake. Believing Eugene was too far away to interfere, the Ottoman army had begun to cross the Tisa River at the town of Zenta. The Sultan and his elite cavalry were already across, but the bulk of his army, the infantry, the artillery, the entire baggage train, and the war chest, was still on the near side, preparing to cross a single rickety pontoon bridge. They were trapped, half the army on one side, half on the other, with a river at their back. This was the moment. It was a general's dream, an opportunity to annihilate an enemy in one stroke. But Eugene had his orders. Do not engage. A messenger from Vienna would take weeks. The opportunity would be gone in hours. Eugene stood in his tent, surrounded by his stunned staff. He looked at the map. He looked at the reports from his scouts. He looked at the political leash from Vienna, a leash designed to make him fail, and he made the decision that would define his life. He chose to disobey. "I will attack," he declared. He immediately ordered a forced march. His army, sensing the urgency in their commander, marched all day and through the night, covering dozens of miles at a grueling pace. They arrived at Zenta on the evening of September 11th, just as the sun was beginning to set. The scene was exactly as his spies had described. The Turkish army was in a state of chaos, still in the process of crossing. Eugene wasted no time. He didn't wait for morning. He didn't wait for his full army to deploy. He ordered an immediate, all-out assault. He arrayed his forces in a massive crescent, its tips designed to pin the Turks against the riverbank. At 6 p.m., as the sun dipped to the horizon, the imperial artillery opened fire. Then the infantry and dragoons charged. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. The Turkish soldiers, panicked and disorganized, were packed into a tight bridgehead, unable to form lines, unable to maneuver Eugene's cannons. Firing point blank tore horrific gaps in their ranks. His infantry poured musket fire into the trapped mass. The only escape was the bridge. Thousands of men rushed for it at once. Under the combined weight of panicked men, horses, and wagons, the pontoon bridge collapsed, casting thousands into the Tisa River. The elite janissaries, trapped on the near bank, made a desperate last stand around their sacred banners. They were cut down. The Grand Vizier, trying to rally his men, was killed, his head presented to Eugene. The battle lasted just 2 hours. By the time darkness fell, it was over. The results were beyond staggering. Over 20,000 Turkish soldiers were killed, either by shot or drowning. Another 10,000 were wounded or captured. The Sultan, Mustafa II, who had been dining in his tent on the far side, could only watch in horror as his entire army was annihilated. He fled in the night, abandoning his royal tent, his war chest, and the imperial seal of the Ottoman Empire. Prince Eugene's losses were 429 men killed. He had not just defeated the Ottoman army, he had erased it. He sat down and wrote 2 letters. The first was a simple factual report to the emperor, detailing the victory. The second was a blistering, sarcastic, and utterly insubordinate letter to the War Council in Vienna. I have, he wrote, in all due submission, dared to risk a little more than my orders permitted. I trust that this liberty, which has resulted in an action so glorious for His Majesty's arms, will be graciously forgiven. When the news reached Vienna, the city erupted in delirious joy. But inside the Habsburg palace, the War Council was apoplectic. He had disobeyed. He had defied them. And worse, he had succeeded on a scale they could not have imagined, making them look like petty, incompetent fools. When Eugene returned to Vienna, he was not greeted with a triumphal parade. He was summoned to the emperor's chambers, and to the shock of the army, was placed under house arrest. His enemies, led by Starhemberg, demanded a court-martial. He was formally charged with high crimes, risking the imperial army, disobeying a direct order from the emperor. For a few terrifying days, it seemed the man who had just won the war was about to be broken by politics. Eugene, as always, was cold, defiant, and blunt. He did not beg for forgiveness. He did not plead. He simply unbuckled his sword, the sword of a field marshal, and placed it on the emperor's desk. "My actions are before you," he reportedly said. "They were taken for the good of your Majesty's service. If I am to be judged a criminal for this victory, I will gladly surrender my commission. But if I am to remain in command, I will do so only with your Majesty's full confidence, and without my hands being tied by men who are not on the battlefield." It was an ultimatum. The army, which adored him, waited with bated breath. The people of Vienna, who saw him as their savior, were muttering darkly about the white wigs. Emperor Leopold, a cautious man, was no fool. He saw the truth. He saw the adulation of the army. He saw the staggering scale of the victory. He stood up, took Eugene's sword, and handed it back to him. He not only dismissed all charges, but he publicly censured the War Council. He confirmed Eugene as the supreme commander. The political coup had failed. Eugene had won on the battlefield, and now he had won at court. The Battle of Zenta broke the will of the Ottoman Empire. It led directly to the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699. The 16-year war was over. Hungary was, for the first time in centuries, entirely under Habsburg control. The Ottoman threat to Central Europe was extinguished for good. Prince Eugene of Savoy, the 36-year-old outcast, was the most celebrated soldier in Europe. He had avenged his humiliation, secured his new homeland, and silenced his critics. He returned to Vienna a colossus, the undisputed hero of the age. He used his share of the captured Turkish treasure to begin construction of a modest summer palace, a place where he could house his growing library and find some peace. He called it the Belvedere. But peace was the one thing he would never be allowed. As the 17th century drew to a close, a new and even more terrible shadow was gathering. In Madrid, the childless, sickly King Charles II of Spain was dying. His death, everyone knew, would ignite a fire that would engulf the entire continent, a war for the very soul of Europe. This new war would pit Eugene not against the Turks, but against his old nemesis, France, and it would force him into an alliance and a rivalry with the only other man on the continent who could claim to be his equal, a brilliant, handsome, and charming English general named John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough. Prince Eugene of Savoy, the hero of Zenta, was now the most powerful man in the Habsburg Empire, second only to the emperor himself. He was 36 years old and had been appointed president of the Imperial War Council. The little abbot, the foreign outcast, was now, in effect, the minister of war, responsible for the entire military apparatus of the state. He had earned this power not through politics, which he despised, but through victory, which he delivered with brutal efficiency. His enemies at court, the White Whigs, who had tried to have him court-martialed, were silenced, though they remained simmering with resentment in the shadows. Eugene spent the brief years of peace, the last he would know for a long time, doing what he did best, working. He threw himself into the Sisyphean task of reforming the Austrian army. He fought the bureaucrats for every musket, every loaf of bread, every pair of boots. He knew with a chilling certainty that the peace was just an interlude. The 17th century was about to bleed into the 18th, and a political time bomb, ticking for decades in Madrid, was about to explode. The bomb was a man, King Charles II of Spain. The last of the Spanish Habsburgs, Charles was a tragic figure, the product of generations of royal inbreeding. He was sickly, epileptic, impotent, and mentally frail. He had ruled, in name, over a vast global empire, but he had failed in the one essential duty of a king. He had produced no heir. For 30 years, the courts of Europe had been engaged in a ghoulish game of who gets the body. The two main claimants were the Austrian Habsburgs, led by Emperor Leopold I, and the French Bourbons, led by Louis XIV. A partition of the empire seemed the only way to avoid a continental war. But on November 1st, 1700, the tragic king finally died, and his will, when read, was a bombshell that shattered the peace of Europe. Pressured by his pro-French counselors, Charles II had left his entire undivided empire, not to his Austrian cousins, but to Philip of Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV. The Sun King, now an old man but no less ambitious, was faced with a choice. He could accept the will, or he could honor the previous partition treaty. It was no choice at all. He strode into his court at Versailles, presented his grandson, and declared, "Gentlemen, behold the King of Spain." The terror that swept through the other capitals, London, Amsterdam, and especially Vienna, was immediate and existential. This was not just a dynastic change. This was the creation of a universal monarchy, a united Franco-Spanish superpower, a Catholic colossus controlling the armies of France, the navies of Spain, and the incalculable wealth of the New World. It would mean the end of England, the end of the Dutch Republic, and the total encirclement and destruction of the Austrian Habsburgs. Emperor Leopold I, in a fit of dynastic rage, refused to accept the will. He declared his own son, Archduke Charles, the rightful King of Spain. War was inevitable. England and the Dutch Republic, seeing their very survival at stake, joined Austria to form a new grand alliance. The conflict that ensued would last for 13 years, kill over 1 million people, and be fought on a global scale. It would be known as the War of the Spanish Succession. For Prince Eugene, his life's work of reform was cut short. The war was here, and the emperor had only one man he could trust to lead the fight. The first and most critical front was in Italy. The Spanish-held territories of Milan and Naples were vital to Austrian security. Louis XIV had already marched his armies into them, securing the key Alpine passes. Eugene was given command. His task was daunting. He was to lead a poorly supplied, hastily assembled Austrian army into Italy, where he was heavily outnumbered by a veteran French army led by an old, familiar enemy, Marshal Nicolas Catinat, one of France's finest and most cautious commanders, the man who had beaten Eugene at Staffarda and Marsaglia. In the spring of 1701, Eugene assembled his army in Tyrol, Catinat, comfortably established in the plains of Lombardy, had fortified every known pass. He knew Eugene was coming. He just didn't know where. He placed his forces to block the two main routes, assuming logically that no commander would be mad enough to try another way, but Eugene was not a logical commander. He was a lateral thinker. He had spent the winter poring over ancient maps and interrogating local hunters and smugglers, and he had found a route, a series of treacherous, winding paths and sheer cliffs that was considered completely impassable for a modern army, let alone one with artillery, cavalry, and thousands of wagons. This was precisely why Eugene chose it. What followed was one of the great logistical feats of the age. Eugene put his army to work. They became pioneers, engineers. They spent weeks widening paths, building wooden supports, and dismantling artillery. Cannons were hauled up sheer rock faces by ropes and pulleys. Their barrels and carriages moved separately. Thousands of mules were used to ferry supplies. All of this was done in near total secrecy. French patrols saw no activity at the main passes and reported back to Catinat that Eugene was still waiting, undecided. Then, in late May 1701, Eugene's entire army of 30,000 men, cavalry, infantry, and cannons, descended from the impassable mountains and emerged, as if from the earth itself, onto the plains of Italy, completely behind Catinat's fortified lines. The French high command was thrown into total confusion. Catinat, his entire defensive strategy rendered useless, was forced to abandon his lines and scramble to reposition his army. Eugene was now the hunter, not the hunted. He feinted, he parried, he outmarched the French at every turn, living off the land. On July 9th, 1701, at the Battle of Carpi, Eugene used his superior mobility to attack an isolated French corps. The fighting was fierce, and Eugene, as was his custom, was in the thick of it. He led a cavalry charge himself and was badly wounded, a serious shot to his left knee. He refused to leave the field, propping himself up on his horse, and directed the battle until the French were routed. The victory sent shockwaves across Europe. The Turkish slayer had now beaten the finest army in Europe, commanded by one of its most respected marshals, Louis XIV, furious at Catinat's failure, promptly sacked him. And he replaced him with a man who was his polar opposite. The Duc de Villeroy was a court favorite, a charming, handsome, and profoundly arrogant man who owed his command to his friendship with the king, not his talent. He was, in short, a fool, and Eugene knew it. Villeroy arrived in Italy brimming with contempt for the little abbé and his ragged Austrian army. He boasted to the king that he would soon have Eugene running back to Vienna with his tail between his legs. Eugene let him boast. He let the overconfident Villeroy settle into his comfortable winter headquarters in the fortified city of Cremona. And then he planned one of the most audacious operations in military history. It was the dead of winter, February 1st, 1702. The war was supposed to be dormant. Eugene had learned from a local priest of a secret, an old unguarded aqueduct that ran from the countryside directly into the cellars of a house inside Cremona. This was a mission for a handful of men, not an army. Eugene handpicked 400 of his best grenadiers. That night, in freezing sleet, they slipped into the aqueduct, and one by one emerged into the sleeping city at the same time. Another force disguised as farmers overpowered the guards at one of the city gates and led in Eugene's cavalry. By 4 a.m., Eugene himself was inside the walls, leading his men through the dark streets. The raid on Cremona had begun. It was utter chaos. The French garrison, numbering over 12,000 men, awoke to find Austrian cavalry charging down the main square. The commandos assigned to capture Villeroy stormed his headquarters. They found the marshal, who had been woken by the gunfire, fumbling for his clothes. He was seized, still in his nightshirt, and declared a prisoner. For a few hours it seemed the city would fall, but the French, though leaderless, were professionals. An Irish regiment in French service, the Regiment of Dillon, had been at morning mass and was the only unit already armed. They formed a defensive line in the streets and held back the Austrian advance long enough for the rest of the garrison to rally Eugene. Seeing the element of surprise was lost and that he was now hopelessly outnumbered in a street-to-street brawl, made the cold calculation to withdraw. He had failed to take the city, but he had taken its commander-in-chief. As his men retreated, they took the sputtering, furious Marshal Villeroy with them. The operation was a tactical failure, but a stunning propaganda victory. All of Europe laughed. Louis XIV was humiliated, his boisterous favorite captured in his pajamas. The Pope, when told the news, quipped, "A great pity they did not capture the town as well, but at least they have the shepherd." Eugene had cemented his reputation. He was not just a general, he was a trickster, a man of terrifying cunning and audacity. But the war in Italy bogged down. The French, now reinforced and led by the far more competent Duc de Vendôme, pushed Eugene back. The campaign of 1702 was a frustrating stalemate, and in 1703 the entire war was on the verge of collapse. While Eugene was bogged down in Italy, Louis XIV had executed a brilliant strategic masterstroke. He had convinced the Elector of Bavaria, Maximilian II Emmanuel, to switch sides and declare for France. This was a catastrophe. Bavaria, in the heart of the empire, was a dagger pointed at Vienna. A powerful French army under Marshal Marsin linked up with the Bavarian army together. They began a relentless push down the Danube. By the end of 1703, the Franco-Bavarian army was poised to do what Kara Mustafa had failed to do: take Vienna. Emperor Leopold, in a panic, recalled Eugene, but Eugene's army was pinned in Italy. He couldn't extract it. The situation seemed hopeless. It was in this, the darkest hour of the war, that the second great hero of this story steps onto the stage. John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, was, in many ways, Eugene's complete opposite. Where Eugene was small, dark, and ascetic, Marlborough was tall, famously handsome, and exuded an effortless charm. Where Eugene was blunt, tactless, and hated politics, Marlborough was the consummate courtier, a master of diplomacy and persuasion. But in one critical area, they were identical. They were both military geniuses of the highest order. Marlborough was in command of the English and Dutch forces in the Spanish Netherlands. He was as frustrated as Eugene, shackled by his cautious, risk-averse Dutch allies, who refused to let him engage in a decisive battle. He saw the Bavarian threat and understood, as Eugene did, that if Vienna fell, the war was over. In the spring of 1704, Marlborough conceived one of the most audacious gambles in military history. He decided in secret to march his entire army, over 40,000 men, from the Netherlands, hundreds of miles across Germany, to the Danube, to link up with Eugene and save the emperor. He couldn't tell anyone. The Dutch would have forbidden it. The French would have intercepted him. So he lied. He told his allies he was merely planning a campaign on the Moselle River. He began his march, a vast column of red-coated English and blue-coated Dutch and German mercenaries. The French, confused, sent armies to shadow him, trying to guess his intentions. But Marlborough was too fast. He outmarched them, slipping away, a phantom army moving relentlessly southeast. In June 1704, near the town of Mundelsheim, the two greatest generals of the age met for the first time. The meeting was electric. There was no jealousy, no rivalry. It was a meeting of minds. They recognized instantly the genius in each other. They formed a bond of professional respect and genuine personal affection that would last their entire lives. They would become known as the twin generals. Marlborough, the elder by 13 years, wrote to his wife Sarah that he was charmed by the prince, finding him a man of judgment and good sense, free from the fawning and flattery I am so sick of. Eugene, for his part, had finally found an equal. He now had a partner who understood war as he did, as a game of speed, audacity, and annihilation. The strategic situation was complex. The combined Franco-Bavarian army, under the Elector and two French marshals, Tallard and Marsin, was on the north bank of the Danube. Eugene had managed to bring a small army from Italy, while another imperial army under the Margrave of Baden was also in the area. Marlborough and Eugene had to deal with the stubborn, incompetent Margrave, who by protocol was their senior. In a brilliant diplomatic stroke, they got rid of him by convincing him to take his 15,000 men to lay siege to the nearby city of Ingolstadt, leaving them free to command the main Allied army. Now it was just the two of them. They agreed on a unique command structure. They would command the Allied army on alternate days. On August 13, 1704, their scouts reported that the Franco-Bavarian army, nearly 60,000 strong, had taken up a strong defensive position near the small village of Blenheim. They were encamped between the Danube River and the wooded hills of the Swabian Jura. Their front was protected by a small marshy stream called the Nebel. They were confident, dug in, and they outnumbered the Allies. Marlborough and Eugene rode to a nearby church tower to survey the enemy position. Their generals were unanimous. It was madness to attack. The position was too strong. The Nebel stream was an impassable barrier. They should wait for the Margrave's siege to conclude Marlborough, and Eugene looked at each other. They knew that to wait was to lose the initiative. They knew that a decisive blow was needed. They would attack, and they would attack tomorrow. The plan they devised that night was one of pure, brutal, and elegant simplicity. It was a classic pin and smash. The enemy line was over 4 miles long. On the right, Marshal Tallard commanded the main French army, his flank anchored by the village of Blenheim, which he had packed with 10,000 of his best infantry. On the left, the Elector of Bavaria and Marshal Marsin commanded the Bavarian and other French troops. The center, linking the two, was held by thousands of cavalry. But Tallard had made a crucial mistake. He believed the marshy Nebel stream made a full-scale assault on his center impossible. The Allied plan was this: Eugene, commanding the right wing, would launch a massive full-scale assault on the left flank held by the Elector and Marsin. His job was to fight so fiercely that he would pin them in place and critically draw all their reserves to him. This was a sacrificial, brutal assignment. Marlborough, commanding the left wing, would launch a similar pinning assault on the village of Blenheim itself, locking Tallard's 10,000 elite troops in a street fight. Then, once both flanks of the enemy army were fully engaged and their reserves committed, Marlborough would unleash his true attack. A colossal force of cavalry, held in reserve, straight through the impassable center. It was a gamble of staggering proportions. If Eugene's attack faltered, or if Marlborough's pinning attack failed, the center thrust would be exposed and annihilated. Everything depended on perfect timing and on the unshakable trust the two generals had in each other. At dawn, the Allied army began to move, advancing in 8 massive columns towards the Nebel. The French and Bavarians were completely surprised. They had assumed the Allies were retreating. They scrambled to form their battle lines. The battle began around 1 p.m. On Marlborough's side, the British redcoats, led by Lord Cutts, the Salamander, launched a suicidal headlong assault on the fortified village of Blenheim. They were met with a murderous point-blank volley of musket fire. The attack was repulsed. They charged again. They were repulsed again with horrific casualties, but they did succeed in trapping Tallard's infantry. The anchor was now a prison. On the right, miles away, Eugene's battle was a desperate, swirling nightmare. The terrain was even worse than expected, a mess of woods and ravines. His Prussian and Austrian infantry, the best he had, charged the entrenched positions of the Elector and Marcian. They were thrown back. They charged again. A gap opened in Eugene's line and French cavalry poured through. His center was on the verge of collapse. Eugene, seeing the disaster, did what he had always done. He personally rode into the storm. He drew his sword and led his reserve cavalry, a regiment of Prussian cuirassiers, in a desperate countercharge. He was in the thick of the melee, fighting hand to hand. A musket ball grazed his head. His horse was nearly shot out from under him. He was a general, a prince, and the war president, but he was fighting like a common trooper. He reportedly saw a regiment of his own cavalry fleeing. He rode to them, drew his pistol, and shot 2 of the troopers dead. He then pointed his pistol at their officer and screamed, "Do you wish to die here, or will you follow me?" Shamed and terrified, the regiment reformed and followed him back into the inferno. For 3 hours, Eugene's wing was on the brink of annihilation. He was pushed back, but he never broke. He was performing his role perfectly, though at a terrible cost. He was drawing all of Marcin's and the Elector's reserves, who believed he was the main threat. Meanwhile, Marlborough, seeing his own flank secured, and Eugene's desperate struggle succeeding in its objective, knew the moment had come. He ordered his engineers to lay pontoon bridges and fascines across the impassable Navel stream. Around 5 p.m., he assembled his killer blow, 8,000 cavalry, drawn up in 2 massive lines, supported by infantry Marshal Tallard. His reserves, all committed to the flanks, could only watch in horror as this tidal wave of steel began to move, trotting across the stream and forming up on his side. He frantically sent for his own elite cavalry, the gendarmes, the pride of France. They countercharged. This was the decisive moment of the 18th century. 10,000 horsemen smashing into each other in the center of the field. The French line held, buckled, and then shattered. Marlborough's cavalry, led by the English Life Guards, broke through. The French center, the link between the 2 armies, evaporated. The Franco-Bavarian army was cut in 2. The battle was over. The annihilation began. On the left, the Elector and Marcin, seeing the center collapse, organized a full-scale desperate retreat, still hounded by Eugene's exhausted but victorious troops. On the right, Marshal Tallard's 10,000 men in Blenheim were now completely surrounded. Marlborough brought up his artillery and began to level the village. The French, leaderless and with no hope of escape, did the unthinkable. The elite regiment of Navarre, a unit that had never before surrendered, laid down its arms. Over 10,000 French soldiers became prisoners of war. As the sun set, the scale of the victory became clear. The Franco-Bavarian army had ceased to exist. It had suffered 38,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. Louis XIV's greatest army was gone. Marshal Tallard was a prisoner. Vienna was saved. The Sun King's aura of invincibility, cultivated for 40 years, was broken in a single afternoon. That night, in a captured tavern, Eugene and Marlborough, splattered with mud and blood, sat down to write their reports. On the back of a small scrap piece of paper, Marlborough famously scribbled a note to his wife. "I have not time to say more, but to beg you will give my duty to the Queen and let her know her army has had a glorious victory. Eugene's note to the emperor was just as stark. I have the honor to inform your imperial majesty that the enemy is today completely defeated. The Elector of Bavaria and Marshal Marcin are in full retreat. Marshal Tallard and many of his generals are prisoners. His army is ruined. The Battle of Blenheim was one of the great turning points in European history. It saved the Habsburg Empire and ensured the Grand Alliance would not collapse. It was also the beginning of the legendary partnership. Eugene and Marlborough, the twin generals, had shown the world what two men, united in purpose and genius, could achieve. The Battle of Blenheim had saved the Habsburg Empire. It had electrified Europe and turned John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, and Prince Eugene of Savoy into the most celebrated men of their age. They were the twin generals, the unstoppable partnership that had, in a single afternoon, broken the back of Louis XIV's ambitions. In the euphoric aftermath, they were toasted in London, Amsterdam, and Vienna. But a single victory, even one as total as Blenheim, does not win a global war. As the winter of 1704 turned to 1705, the Grand Alliance faced grim realities. The Bavarian dagger had been blunted, but the war still raged on multiple fronts. In the Netherlands, in Spain, and most critically for Eugene, in his old frustrating theater of Italy. While Eugene had been saving the emperor on the Danube, the French had been methodically dismantling the Allied position in Piedmont. The Austrian army there, leaderless and starved of supplies, was on the brink of collapse. Eugene's cousin, the ever-unreliable Fox of Savoy, Victor Amadeus II, was losing his territory city. By city, the twin generals were forced to part ways. Marlborough, the charismatic diplomat, returned to the Netherlands to wrangle his cautious Dutch allies and face the main French armies. Eugene, the iron-willed troubleshooter, was given the task he dreaded most: go back to Italy and fix the unfixable. He arrived in April 1705 to find a situation that was not just bad, it was catastrophic. The army he was meant to lead was a ghost. It was a collection of skeletal, unpaid men, their uniforms in rags, their morale shattered. They were deserting in droves, and worse, they were facing a new and far more formidable opponent. Louis XIV, having learned his lesson from the capture of the incompetent Villeroy at Cremona, had dispatched his finest field commander to Italy, Louis Joseph, Duc de Vendôme. If you were to design the perfect rival for Prince Eugene, you would create Vendôme. He was Eugene's complete antithesis and perhaps his most dangerous opponent. Where Eugene was a cold, ascetic, intellectual workaholic who lived like a monk, Vendôme was a man of gargantuan appetites. He was famously slothful, decadent, and personally filthy. He was known to conduct his morning briefings with his staff while sitting on his chamber pot, and he often led his troops into battle wearing a nightgown, his face caked in snuff. But he was also a brilliant, intuitive general, beloved by his common soldiers, who adored his informality and his fiery, brawling courage. He was a soldier's soldier, a tactical genius who fought from the gut, and he had Eugene cornered. Vendôme's army was larger, better fed, and controlled all the key river crossings. Eugene's task, as he wrote to Marlborough in a moment of rare despair, was not to win a battle, but simply to keep an army in existence. For months, the two masters of war engaged in a deadly chess match across the plains of Lombardy. It was a war of marches, feints, and river crossings. Eugene, desperate to gain the initiative, tried to trap a portion of Vendôme's army, but on August 16, 1705, Vendôme, who was supposed to be miles away, showed his intuitive brilliance. He anticipated Eugene's move and force-marched his army, setting a trap of his own at the town of Cassano on the Adda River. Eugene, believing he was attacking an isolated rearguard, instead slammed headlong into Vendôme's main force, which was hidden behind a series of canals and embankments. The Battle of Cassano was not a battle of elegant maneuvers. It was a bloodbath. It was a close quarters, grinding infantry brawl fought in mud and across narrow bridges. Eugene, as always, was at the very front. Seeing his elite Prussian infantry stall at a key bridge, he dismounted and prepared to lead the charge on foot, sword in hand. As he advanced, a French volley erupted. A musket ball struck him in the throat. The wound was severe. Blood poured from his neck and he collapsed. His staff, horrified, rushed to carry him to the rear. The line began to waver, the cry going up that the prince was dead. But Eugene was not a normal man. He was, as one of his officers wrote, a man made of iron. He refused to be moved. He pressed a field dressing to his own neck, and his voice, a choked whisper, continued to give orders. He had his men prop him up on his horse, and for the next 3 hours he sat in the saddle, bleeding, unable to speak above a rasp, refusing to concede the field. His sheer, terrifying willpower inspired his men to superhuman efforts. The Prussians held their ground. The battle raged until nightfall, when both armies, mutually exhausted and shattered, fell back. It was a draw, though Vendôme, who held the field, claimed it as a victory. Eugene had lost 4,000 men, but he had survived. He had proven to the French that even outnumbered and wounded, his army was not broken. It was a testament to his sheer, stubborn tenacity, but it was a hollow victory. He had been badly wounded, his army was crippled, and as he retreated to winter quarters, the strategic situation remained disastrous. The winter of 1705 to 1706 was the lowest point of Eugene's career. While he traveled to Vienna to recover from his wound and plead with the emperor for more men and money, the white wigs at court whispered that the French boy had finally met his match. Worse, in his absence, Vendôme, a master of winter warfare, launched a surprise campaign. On April 19, 1706, at the Battle of Calcenedo, he attacked Eugene's army, which was under a subordinate's command. It wasn't a battle, it was a rout. The imperial army was shattered, its remnants scattered. The news that reached Eugene was a drumbeat of disaster. His army was in tatters. His cousin Victor Amadeus was now a king without a kingdom, on the run, hiding in the mountains with a few thousand loyal troopers. Every major city in Piedmont had fallen. Only one prize remained: Turin. In May 1706, the French, now numbering over 70,000 men, laid siege to Victor Amadeus's capital. The city was well defended, its garrison of 10,000 men determined, but it was only a matter of time. The French began digging their siege lines, a massive 18-mile-long network of trenches and redoubts that encircled the city. If Turin fell, the war in Italy was over. France would be victorious, and the Habsburgs would lose all of their Italian holdings. Eugene, now back in command, was in an impossible position. He was in Tyrol to the east with a newly raised army, but he was on the wrong side of the Po River, and the French controlled every bridge, every road. His situation seemed hopeless. And then Louis XIV made a fatal mistake. On May 23, 1706, hundreds of miles away in the Netherlands, Eugene's twin, the Duke of Marlborough, had won a spectacular Blenheim-like victory at the Battle of Ramillies. He had routed the French army there and sent Louis XIV into a full-blown panic. The French king, desperate to stop Marlborough, recalled his best general, Vendôme, from Italy to go and face the English general. In Vendôme's place, he sent a committee. The nominal commander was his own nephew, the young, brave, but inexperienced Philip, Duc d'Orléans. But the real power was held by the man sent to advise him, Marshal Ferdinand de Marsin. This was the very same Marshal Marsin who had commanded the left wing at Blenheim. He was a cautious, pessimistic man who had already been humiliated by Eugene, and was, by all accounts, terrified of him. The energetic, intuitive genius of Vendôme was replaced by the timid, by-the-book indecision of Marsin. Eugene knew this was his moment. The French army at Turin, though massive, was now leaderless, its command divided and nervous. He had to act. He now conceived a march just as audacious as Marlborough's march to the Danube, but this time he was doing it solo, and in the face of a superior enemy. In July 1706, he put his army of 25,000 men in motion. He abandoned his supply lines, his heavy baggage, and marched south. For 6 weeks, he led the French on a chase, a brilliant campaign of maneuver. He feinted east, then swung west, marching at a punishing pace. He crossed the mighty Po River in a daring nighttime operation, catching the French patrols completely off guard. The French commanders, Marsin and d'Orléans, were paralyzed with the indecision. They couldn't believe Eugene would be so reckless. By the time they realized he was not fainting, he was past them. On August 29th, Eugene and his exhausted, ragged army finally marched into the camp of his cousin, Victor Amadeus, who had eluded capture in the mountains. The two cousins, the fox and the warlord, were reunited. Their combined force was now about 30,000 men. The French army besieging Turin numbered over 40,000, dug into some of the most formidable siege lines in European history. The next morning, September 1st, Eugene and Victor Amadeus rode to the Superga, a high hill overlooking the city and the vast French camp below them. The scene was breathtaking. The city of Turin was a smoking ruin, under constant bombardment. Encircling it was the massive French entrenchment, a city of its own, bristling with cannons. The Allied generals were grim. To attack such a position was suicide. They were outnumbered and the enemy was fortified. But as Eugene scanned the lines with his telescope for hours, his cold, brilliant mind saw what the French commanders had missed. The siege lines were a masterpiece of 17th century engineering, but they had one fatal flaw. They had been built by a general, Vendôme, who was defending against a small broken army. They were not built to withstand an attack from a new, full-sized field army from the rear. The lines were too long, over 18 miles. The French troops were spread thin, and their rear, the section facing away from the city, was their weakest point. Marsin, the timid, had made it worse. Instead of concentrating his forces, he had scattered them, trying to defend every inch of the line. Eugene turned to his cousin. "I think," he said quietly, "they are already half beaten." Back in their camp, Eugene convened a council of war. His plan was simple, brutal, and utterly insane. He would not try to maneuver. He would not try a feint. He would gather his entire army into one massive column and launch an all-or-nothing full-frontal assault on the strongest, central part of the French lines. His generals were aghast. This was a violation of every military textbook. It was a suicidal charge against an entrenched, superior enemy. But Eugene had seen the psychological state of the French. He knew they were commanded by a committee, by a man who already feared him. He was not just attacking their trenches, he was attacking their will. He would attack on September 7th. Inside the French camp, the divided command was coming apart. The Duc d'Orléans, young and courageous, argued that they should abandon the siege, march out, and meet Eugene in an open battle. Marshal Marsin, haunted by the ghost of Blenheim, refused. He was terrified of meeting Eugene in the open. He insisted they stay behind their trenches, arguing that no army in the world could break them. He got his wish. At dawn on September 7th, 1706, an early morning mist shrouded the fields. Eugene's army advanced not in a broad line, but in deep, narrow, wedge-shaped columns, aimed like spears at the heart of the French position. He had placed his best troops at the very front, the elite Prussian grenadiers, men he had personally trained and trusted, led by the formidable Leopold of Anhalt-Dessau. At 10 a.m., the mist cleared, and the French lookouts stared in disbelief. The entire imperial army was not flanking, not feinting, but charging straight at them. The French cannons opened up, tearing horrific holes in the advancing columns. But the wedge did not stop. It was a juggernaut of disciplined rage. The Prussian grenadiers reached the ditch, threw themselves in, and began clawing their way up the other side, firing their muskets and throwing grenades into the stunned French defenders Eugene was not directing from the rear. He was, as always, at the very front, just behind the Prussians, sword in hand. As he urged his men forward, a French volley erupted. A bullet struck his first horse. It collapsed dead, trapping his leg. His staff rushed to pull him free. He was given a second horse. He mounted, led another charge, and this horse, too, was shot and killed, collapsing on top of him. His men saw this. They saw their prince, their commander, twice unhorsed, twice nearly killed, yet still advancing, still leading, seemingly indestructible. A wave of fanaticism swept through the imperial ranks. They surged over the parapet. The fighting in the trenches was savage, a hand-to-hand nightmare. For over an hour, the battle hung on a knife edge. The French, despite their poor leadership, were veterans, and they fought desperately. At that critical moment, a small detachment of French grenadiers, having found a secret sally port, managed to get inside the city's citadel. This was the disaster the defenders had feared. But as the French soldiers charged down a dark subterranean tunnel, they were met by a single Piedmontese sapper. Pietro Mica, and a comrade were guarding a barrel of gunpowder, intended to collapse the tunnel if breached. The fuse was a long one, designed to give them time to escape, but there was no time. The French were seconds away. Mica shoved his comrade, yelling, "Get out of here! You're longer than a day without bread." He knew what he had to do. He couldn't wait for the long fuse. He took his powder horn, created a short, quick fuse, and lit it with his lantern. The explosion was deafening. Pietro Mica was blown to pieces, but the tunnel collapsed, killing the French grenadiers and saving the citadel. It was an act of ultimate sacrifice at the perfect decisive moment. Back at the main front, Eugene's relentless assault was breaking the French line. Marshal Marsin, desperately trying to rally his crumbling center, was struck by a cannonball. His leg shattered. He fell, mortally wounded. The Duc d'Orléans, leading a cavalry charge, was also badly wounded and taken from the field. The French command structure ceased to exist. At the same time, the city's garrison, led by Victor Amadeus, saw the imperial standards on the French ramparts. They launched their own sally, streaming out of the city gates and smashing into the French rear. It was over. The French army, caught between Eugene's assault from the front and the garrison's attack from behind, leaderless and terrified, broke. It was not a retreat. It was a total, panicked rout. They abandoned their cannons, their tents, their supplies, their wounded, including their commander, the dying Marshal Marsin. By the afternoon, the entire French army of Italy was destroyed, fleeing in terror back towards France. Eugene, covered in dust and blood, his voice raw, rode into the liberated city of Turin to meet his cousin. He had done it. He had saved the city. He had saved Italy. 1706 was the high water mark. With Eugene's victory at Turin and Marlborough's at Ramillies, the twin generals had brought the Sun King to his knees, Louis XIV, his army shattered and treasury empty, sued for peace. The war should have ended, but it did not. The Allies, drunk on success, made impossible, humiliating demands. They demanded Louis use his own army to depose his grandson in Spain. The old king, in a final act of defiance, refused. The war dragged on for Eugene. This meant a new objective. In 1707, he planned a dagger stroke, an invasion of France itself, aimed at the great naval base of Toulon. It was a disaster. The plan was poisoned from the start, not by the French, but by his own allies. The Austrian emperor suddenly ordered Eugene to divert 10,000 of his best troops on a pointless side mission to Naples. Eugene was apoplectic, but he had to obey. He invaded France with a critically weakened army. His other ally, the Duke of Savoy, was terrified of French retribution and intentionally dragged his feet, losing all element of surprise. By the time Eugene reached Toulon, the fortress was fully manned. The siege failed miserably. Disease and French cannons decimated his army. He was forced into a humiliating retreat. It was his first great public defeat, and it taught him a bitter lesson. Politics could kill more surely than a bullet. Meanwhile, the situation in the Netherlands had become desperate. The French, under Eugene's old rival Vendôme, had staged a comeback, capturing the vital cities of Ghent and Bruges-Marlborough, was trapped. He sent an urgent message to Eugene. "I need you, now." Eugene didn't hesitate. He force-marched his cavalry for 3 days, covering nearly 150 miles. The twin generals were reunited. They struck immediately. On July 11, 1708, they caught the French army on the move at the Battle of Oudenarde. It wasn't a planned battle, it was a chaotic, sprawling brawl. In an ultimate act of trust, Marlborough gave Eugene command of the entire right wing. Eugene became the anvil, absorbing the main French attack, while Marlborough led the hammer, a massive, encircling flank maneuver. By nightfall, the French army was trapped and completely disintegrated. It was a perfect victory. They pushed their advantage, deciding to do the impossible: besiege Lille, the most impregnable fortress in the world. Eugene would command the brutal assault. Marlborough would command the covering army protecting him. The siege was a 120-day nightmare of trench warfare. Eugene lived in the mud with his men. In September, while leading an assault, a musket ball struck him in the head, just above his left eye. He collapsed, unconscious. The army thought he was dead. Days later, he was back in the trench, his head wrapped in a massive bandage, his eyes swollen shut, directing the cannons. This act of pure, insane courage broke the defenders' will. Lille fell. The road to Paris was open. Then nature itself intervened. The Great Frost of 1709 was a climate apocalypse. France, already beaten, was now starving to death. Louis XIV knew he was finished. He sent his ministers to get peace at any cost. He offered total unconditional surrender. He agreed to everything. And then the Allies made their fatal, arrogant mistake. They didn't trust him. They added Article 37. It was not enough for Louis to abandon his grandson. He must use the French army to personally attack his grandson. It was an insult no king could bear. Louis XIV did something unprecedented. He published the Allies' demands to his people. A wave of patriotic fury united the starving, broken nation. France miraculously raised one last army and gave it to their best general, Marshal Villars. The twin generals had won every battle, but their arrogant diplomacy had just lost the war, and they were about to walk into the bloodiest day of the 18th century.